Liebe Unterstützer von Stay Forever, wir schließen unsere Staffel zu Sherlock, Riddle of the Crown Jewels wie gewohnt mit einem Interview mit dem Designer des Spiels ab. In diesem Fall ist das Bob Bates. Das Interview ist auf Englisch, soweit so gewohnt, aber dieses Mal gibt's eine kleine Neuerung. Auf eure Anregung hin haben wir uns entschlossen, am Ende des Gesprächs eine kurze Zusammenfassung auf Deutsch anzuhängen. Für die von euch, die es lieber kompakt mögen oder denen das Englische nicht ganz so leicht fällt. Und das ist dann auch nochmal eine gute Gelegenheit, um auf unsere Kapitelmarken hinzuweisen, die wir immer dann in Podcast-Folgen einfügen, wenn das sinnvoll ist. Die meisten Podcast-Apps und Player unterstützen diese Kapitelmarken und lassen euch damit einzelne Bereiche in der Folge anspringen. In diesem Fall führt euch die Kapitelmarke zur deutschen Zusammenfassung am Ende oder ihr spult einfach vor zu, das müsste ungefähr 1:10 sein. Und nun viel Spaß bei unserem Gespräch mit Bob Bates.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello, I am Gunnar Lott. I'm here today with Bob Bates and my co-host Christian. Bob, nice to have you on the show. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a long time since I looked at this game, and it was an interesting trip into the past.
And hello, Christian.
Hello, everyone.
Bob Bates is an award-winning veteran game designer. He started out in the late 80s. He created games for the legendary text-adventure company Infocom, then went on to found his own legendary perhaps text and graphic adventure company with Mike Verdu. It was called Legend Entertainment, and we've done a few podcasts about their games already. He has designed and written and produced dozens of games, among them adventures, obviously, like Eric the Unready or the Blackstone Chronicles. He did action games like Unreal 2 and The Wheel of Time, serious games like the kind of obscure Quandaries for the Department of Justice in the USA, social games like Empires and Allies, and many, many more. We are here to talk about his first professional game, Sherlock and the Riddle of the Crown Jewels, published in December 1987 by Infocom. So, Bob, Sherlock is the 31st Infocom game and the first one that was developed by an external company, your own company, Challenge Incorporated. Could you tell us in a few sentences the story of how this happened?
Sure. I had been working on a novel. I was not a game player. I was working as a writer, trying to make my way in the literary world in the 1980s. And it was kind of a tough go. My dad, who was a computer enthusiast from way back, in order to help me write my book, gave me a TRS-80 computer to use basically as a word processor instead of a typewriter. And on that computer was a game called Zork. So Zork was the first computer game that I ever played, and I really liked it. I liked it a lot, and I thought, man, I could do this. And so as time went by and I realized that my novel was going to take a really long time to come to fruition, I started thinking about writing interactive fiction, about writing games. And so I started a company called Challenge with the idea that if you think an Infocom game is hard, just wait until you play a Challenge game, because I thought the fun of playing these games was in the challenge of solving puzzles and going after that aha moment when, you've been thinking about something and trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, and you can't do it and you can't do it. And then one day you're walking down the street and it just comes to you and you go, oh, I know that's the answer. You can't wait to get back to the computer and type in that answer. Of course, all typing, no mouse or clicking or anything like that, and see that you had figured it out. So I thought of it very much as a kind of a battle of wits between the game designer and the player, which turns out is really a bad way to think about actually making these games. So I started this company and I had a partner whose name was Dave Wilt. Dave was the computer guy and I was the writer guy. And he said, well, we're going to need to build an engine. And then he said, well, what's better than building an engine? It would be licensing an engine. Who makes a good computer game engine? And I said, well, Infocom. And he says, well, call them up and see if we can license their engine. And I thought he was nuts, absolutely crazy. But I did that. I called up Infocom and talked to Joel Perez, who is their president. And he said, let me think about this and get back to you. And then he called back a little while later and said, okay, we will license you the engine for $1 million. And I was, just flabbergasted and said, that's just not practical. But I went back to them with a counteroffer and I said, well, the economics of this are such that give me a 10-game license for $100,000 each. And they said, oh, that's an interesting counteroffer. Let us think about that. And right then, the chairman of Activision, which had bought Infocom a little while earlier, was planning to come through Washington, D.C., which is where I live, just outside. And I arranged to meet him at Dulles Airport. So one Friday afternoon, I went out to Dulles and met with him. And he said, well, why should we work with you? We don't know anything about you. You've never done a game. And I said, well, here's a list of Infocom games. I have no inside information, anything like that, but I'm going to tell you which ones I think are the best sellers and which ones are the ones that aren't performing well, and here's why. And so I went down the list of their catalog, and he kind of nodded and said, that's pretty interesting. And he flew on back to Los Angeles. And the following Monday, I got a phone call from Joel Perez, and he said, forget the license. We would like to work with you as an outside developer. So make games under the Infocom label instead of competing with us, and we'll work that out. And so that's how all that came to be. I had some games in mind. I wanted to do a game based on Sherlock Holmes, one based on King Arthur, and one based on Robin Hood. And so we called the series the Immortal Legends. And it turns out that I ended up making Sherlock and making Arthur and never did do the Robin Hood game.
You mentioned a very interesting thing here, Bob, which is that analysis of Infocom's catalog of existing titles and your assessment of them. Do you perchance still remember which games you thought were particularly effective and why?
That memory is a little clouded by time. I think I would have picked certainly Planetfall, Trinity, Hitchhikers, of course, Leather Goddesses, and would have predicted that the detective games would not have done as well, partially based on, in one case, the not real-time, but almost real-time way that the game was played in terms of one of the detective games, Suspect or Deadline.
And so you went and made a real-time detective game.
Well, it's not real-time, and it's not exactly, it's sort of a detective game. But again, the idea was to take popular, well-established characters, well-established worlds, where, frankly, a lot of the creative work that makes those places and those worlds interesting had already been done. You know, it's hard to come up with a brand new world and a brand new, really fascinating character. And each of those worlds came with, a strong central character, Holmes and King Arthur and Robin Hood, and a really good cast of supporting characters. In the case of Sherlock, there's Watson and Lestrade and the Baker Street Irregulars and Professor Moriarty, and really evocative worlds that I, as an author, wouldn't have to work all that hard to bring to life. And so I could focus on the writing and the puzzles. And of course, they were all public domain. So there were no license fees for a young, struggling game company to have to deal with. And that's something that we ended up doing quite a bit at Legend Entertainment later on, was doing licensed works where there was already a built-in audience. To some extent, that's a commercial decision. And of course, at the time, especially for the first game, and the first several games up through Time Quest, it was all about the puzzles. It was all about me sitting down and thinking about what the player is trying to do and setting goals for them and sort of leading them towards those goals, and the interplay, the going back and forth between me and the player. I like to think of myself as the little guy inside the box. And so the player would be talking to me and I'd be talking back to him. And that's why in all of my games, and you can see that progression very strongly through time, it becomes a lot about not so much even solving the puzzle, but almost bantering, almost, what do you want to try? What do you want to do that you think is fun? And you think possibly the author will never have thought of, and you try some ridiculous thing, and you get not a default answer like you can't do that, but instead you get, a paragraph of text that says, you try this funny thing, and then this other funny thing happens as a result, and everything in the room blows up, but then somebody comes in and makes it right, and you're right back where you started. So there's no penalty for trying weird stuff, and in fact, it's rewarding to do so. So kind of a long answer to a short question, I guess. Sorry.
This thing that you try to find answers to solutions that are wrong or off, I believe you use it kind of like a trademark and you try to do it often. And in Sherlock, I feel it starts. You've done it there quite a few times, but not as often as in Legend games. But let us start at the beginning with Sherlock Holmes. Are you a fan as well? Were you a reader of the Sherlock Holmes novels?
A big fan. One shelf in my study is packed from one end to the other with just Sherlock books. Books like The 7% Solution. There's a wonderful 2-volume, very big biography of Holmes written by a guy named Baring Gould.
Did you take the timeline your game is set in from the Baring Gould timeline?
No. So I had to take some liberties, which is difficult when you are deep into details with Sherlock, because there are super fans, and I'm not a super fan. So I thought he's an interesting character. And despite the fact that the Holmes that we think of isn't the Holmes that's actually present in the books, I guess the character is present, but when you think of a modern detective story, like a whodunit, and you think of the rules that go into writing that. If you're going to read something by Ellery Queen or John Dixon Carr or Agatha Christie book, one of the rules of that genre is that the reader needs to have all the information that he or she needs in order to solve the puzzle, solve the mystery, solve the murder before the end of the book, so that basically you have a chance to solve it yourself. And so those books are a challenge. They are a guessing game between the author and the reader. When you're reading a whodunit, you're saying, oh, there's this clue. Is that clue important? Sounds like it's important. You try and think about the timeline. Could the murderer have gone from here to there? Did he have enough time? What's his alibi? Does it hold up? And so you're thinking about the group of suspects and all that. And good mystery books play fair with the reader. And in fact, Ellery Queen was famous for, at some point in the novel, the chapter would end and then there'd be a page and it would say, challenge to the reader. You now have all the information that you need in order to solve the murder. Can you do it? And then, you'd read on. If you go back and you read Sherlock Holmes, however, he doesn't do that. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle does not play fair. So you'll be reading a Sherlock Holmes thing, and out of the blue, one of these miraculous deductions that he's so famous for is based on information that was not present in the book. In a game, you can't do that. You have to play fair, obviously, otherwise the player's never going to get anywhere. So I had to make changes to the Sherlockian canon, if you will, and I tried to stick with kind of the main points. But in particular, with regard to the timeline, the year that I chose was the anniversary of Queen Victoria's coronation. And that seemed to just make sense that Professor Moriarty, which is a little early in the timeline for him to show up, but, perhaps this is before he was known to the rest of the world, that he would try and disrupt the coronation festivities by ripping off the crown jewels and helping a foreign power topple the British monarchy.
You mentioned that Moriarty is a little early in the timeline, and that's certainly the case. Yet Sherlock Holmes introduces him to Dr. Watson in the game as somebody he knows very well. So it doesn't come as a surprise for Sherlock Holmes that Moriarty is behind it all. And I felt that a little bit strange.
You know, when you think of Sherlock Holmes, you think of Professor Moriarty, and most people don't have the timeline in their head. And so when you think that you're going to read or play something about Sherlock Holmes, it's quite natural to think that your enemy is going to be the Napoleon of crime himself. And so it was an easy thing to do.
The most striking decision about the game, the most obvious one, is that Sherlock Holmes is not the protagonist. You decided to make Watson the protagonist of the game. Why is that?
It's because in an Infocom game, you play as you. The player character, and this is a debate that goes on, has raged on through the years and still is debated among game designers. Who is the player in the game? Is the player himself? Is the player the character that he plays? And to what extent do players want to be handed a personality? And to what extent do they want to express their own personality within the game? And that's, you know, a question that goes on today. For me, thinking about Sherlock Holmes, he is the really interesting character in this series. He's the star of the series. If you play as Sherlock Holmes, then you have the problem of he's so brilliant, he's so smart. You know, we think of him as somebody who would instantly leap to the grand deduction that would solve the problem, and the solutions would always be obvious to him. And so it was hard for me to imagine that Holmes would kind of stumble around London and not know right away what to do and how to get it done. So the idea was that if you play as Watson, you have a chance then to observe Sherlock Holmes. You have a chance to solve the puzzles, and it kind of makes sense that you might not solve them right away because you're just Watson, you're not Holmes. I have to say, having just played through the game again, I don't know how well I delivered on that idea. Holmes, as it turns out, follows you around all the time. He's pretty useless. Every once in a while, he will pipe up with some piece of knowledge that kind of moves the story along a little bit, but mostly he just follows you. And so while it was my goal to bring out this really cool personality and this really cool detective, I don't think the game really does that. But that's what I was going for.
I'm kind of glad that you said that. He's a more or less useless character, because you have an interesting point there that actually by making Holmes not the protagonist, not the vessel for the player, but a side character, he becomes that much more visible. So there's a chance for him to become alive. There's a chance for us as the character to interact with him, to bounce ideas off of him, to see him interact with the environment or whatnot. But that doesn't happen in the game at all. And because we are not Holmes, because we're observing Holmes, it becomes strikingly apparent that he actually doesn't do anything, even in situations where we would expect him to be of help, because he's constantly following us, which basically at every single step signals to us, okay, there should be a chance of interactivity here. He must be there for a reason. But turns out that for most part of the game, he simply isn't.
Yeah, and there are a few reasons for that. One is the size limitation of the game is handcuffing me or the author at every turn. I think this was a 64K game, 64K kilobytes, not even megabytes. It might have been a 128K, but I think it was 64. And so a lot of things struck me as I played through this game again in preparation for this interview. I hadn't played it in many, many years. And just a couple years ago, I wrote a new text adventure called Thaumastery. And the contrast between the two is really amazing. In Sherlock, the lack of descriptions, the lack even in many cases of giving the room exits.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for that. We so hated that.
Yeah, I found it impossible to play without a map, and I went back into my archives and dug up a map. I tried to play it without looking at hints, as you guys did, in order to understand your experience. And I have to say, I empathize with you a lot. I just was shaking my head and saying, I can't believe that this is that way. And that has specifically to do, number one, with room directions and descriptions, to the point where I wonder if the version that I'm playing is in fact even correct, because I would type in verbose, which is the command that's supposed to give you a really good room description every time you come into it, which can be important. And yet it never did that. And so there's a lot I don't know. I don't know if that's the way the original game shipped. I don't know if that's a result of the port. And the other thing that I wonder is, after the game left my hands, went up to Infocom, it was still too big, and Infocom made cuts to the game that I remember being super angry about, but I also don't remember what they were. And so, in my self-justifying way, I wonder if some of the things that might have been cut in order to get the game down to size might have been some of those things. Now, clearly, that's not true of the core. I think that interacting with Holmes is not something that they cut, but I do wonder about the room descriptions, and I do wonder about the verbose level and the directions, the room exits, which are so important that in Thalmastry, they're up there on the status line, so that you always have an indication of where you can go. And as I pulled out that map, by the way, I found that there were 2 rooms that are on my map that aren't in the game, which is interesting. And that is off of Fleet Street. If you go east on Fleet Street, you entered Blind Alley. And at the end of Blind Alley was a pub called the Red Herring. If you're looking to cut space, the easy way to do that is to cut rooms. I counted them up there. I think there are 94 rooms in all in this game, which is huge. Of course, some of them are empty, which is, again, surprising to me as a game author now. If I'm going to create a room in an adventure game, there's going to be a reason for it to be there and something for the player to do inside of it. But the level of player paranoia that comes from so many of these things, that, there's Holmes, you can't talk to him. Should I be asking him questions? What should I be asking him about? Here I'm in a room. There doesn't seem to be anything to do here. Why not? What am I missing? What am I doing wrong? And the level of player paranoia, I think, in Sherlock is probably greater than in any of my other games. And it's partially because it was the first one.
It's also down to player expectation. I actually didn't mind much that the exits were not given, because mapping the game world is part of the text adventure experience of that era. So I spent a lot of time in my initial sessions simply mapping out London and all of the locations. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of locations. London consists of, I think it's 43 outdoor locations. So as a player, you can cover quite some ground in the city. But if I ultimately look at in which of these locations there's something to be done, some kind of interaction to be had, that boils down to 8 of 43. So that's 18%. And the rest is decorative. And since you have that fast travel system with the hansom cabs, most of the rooms don't even serve as passageways. They're simply pointless, yet they exist. And the thing is that by mapping all of that out, there is a sense of anticipation. I've started imagining all of the wonderful things that will be happening in these locations down the line, all of the characters that I will meet, all of the situations that I will get into. Westminster Abbey is another good example. That is a 17-room location for a single puzzle. An important puzzle, mind you, but still just one, and you only need, I think, 6 of the rooms or so to solve that. And yet, of course, I mapped all of that out. And then, since ultimately nothing much happens in these locations, I went out of this entire experience with a sense of disappointment.
Yeah, and that's reasonable. What I was trying to do with that is create a sense that you're there, and to evoke the idea that so much of British history is right there in that one building. I found it interesting in revisiting the game. Just to walk around the Abbey, to me, brought up the images of the Abbey itself. And so I didn't mind that so much from an atmospheric point of view. The same with the Tower of London. And the other thing that's happening here is, I'm a fan of British history, and that obviously comes through. I lived for 4 years in England when I was growing up. And so, knew a lot of English history and thought a lot of things are interesting. The Great Fire of London and Sir Isaac Newton and his discovery of gravity and King Henry VIII and all of his wives and King Charles who got his head cut off. All of that was pretty interesting. And finding a way to bring some of that to life through the Abbey, through Madame Tussauds, through going through the Tower of London, going into Scotland Yard, even rowing down the Thames. It was an interesting place at an interesting time. And that's what I tried to do with this. And the fact that the environments make it harder on the player, I'd say that that's one of the lessons learned in making this game. The other, by the way, with regard to the Abbey, probably the biggest lesson that I took away from Sherlock as a designer is to not put one of the toughest puzzles at the very beginning of the game. It was a really, really hard puzzle and incredibly persnickety. I think you'll find that over time, I think a lot more about what I call taking care of the player, trying to make sure that they're not in frustrating situations, trying to kind of hold their hand, trying to make the player feel smart with puzzles that the longer you interact with them, the more obvious they become, as opposed to just sitting there as stone walls that the player either has to solve or not solve. That's, for example, one reason why riddles aren't very good in adventure games, because if you don't get the riddle, you don't solve the problem and there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas if you've got a room where there's a puzzle to be solved, a door to be opened, as the player explores the room, some players will come in and they'll know instantly, oh, I know what the answer to this is. If I do this and this, then I'll open the door and get through it. And they feel smart. And that's great. The player who comes in and puzzles over this and wonders, I don't know quite what to do here. And he fiddles around in the room and he looks on the desk and he opens a book that's lying on the bookshelf and gradually accretes more and more clues. And so you are helping the player along. And when they finally tumble to the solution, they open the door and they go through and they feel smart. And they feel just as smart as that first player who solved it right away. And so there's an art to that kind of puzzle design that I developed over the years that's not present really so much in this game. And especially the restore puzzles, which I just cannot believe. There are so many things in Sherlock. You have to save the game, discover something, and then restore back to that point in order to solve a puzzle. And one of my fundamental rules of puzzle design is that in theory, a player should be able to play through the game entirely without ever restoring. They should always have the opportunity to get the information that they need to solve a puzzle within the game without having to go backwards. So the idea of walking into a room and being stuck in that room, learning that you should have brought something into that room, and now you can't get out of the room, and the only way to solve the puzzle is to restore back to where you could pick up that object and come in. That happens throughout this game. I was shocked, actually, by it as I played it.
Yeah, we noticed. I bought the telescope from the street vendor when I first met him, and then the game was done for me, because you cannot just buy the telescope, you have to haggle. The handbook tells you so, or hints at that, but that's a mechanic you don't use naturally. And then the game is factually over. But the game gives you no hint or no clue that you have lost now.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. As I was playing through this time, I bought the telescope, and later a character, we're okay with spoilers here, I guess, right?
Yeah, we're through. Everybody who listens to this interview has heard us discuss the ending even of the game.
Yeah, so Wiggins says, I'm only going to help you out if you give me a shilling. The big mistake that I made in this most recent playthrough is I didn't read the manual. I just jumped into the game. And so there are a couple things in the manual that it wasn't until I finished the game and I read a review of the game that said, oh yeah, you should really read the manual. And that's when I discovered that the manual actually has an example of haggling. But what happened to me was I was playing through, got about to the 50-point mark or thereabouts, and I had kind of done everything there was to do. And there was this guy asking me for a shilling. And I had this notion, that when you bought the telescope and gave the guy a pound note, the game says that he looks at you and he's surprised that you didn't haggle with him. So I said, oh man, as a modern day game player, I went back to the vendor, and if I was designing this puzzle today, I'd find a way to get the shilling out of that guy. But as it turns out, I went back, I haggled with him, and now I had sixpence. And it turns out you have to haggle with him twice. Yeah. And the game gives you no clue about that. And so this is a classic example of what I call dead man walking. You have lost the game and you don't know it. And that's horrible. It's just horrible. So my sincere apologies to you.
Accepted.
And to me, because, I spent a lot of time doing this and looking at it and going on walks and saying, why can't I solve this? Because having played it so long ago, I didn't remember the solutions to these puzzles. In fact, I don't remember the solutions to most puzzles in most of my games within 1 or 2 years after they're done. So this was a big mystery to me, and I felt very incompetent.
The irony about the dead man walking situation in this particular game is that you have a sidekick in Holmes who actually should know. At least if he sees Watson drop a gem into the Thames, he should know that it's over. So you would have had a narrative device in Holmes that tells the player that they've made a mistake here. And unfortunately, that remains unused.
Yeah. And, the very first thing I did in the game was look in Watson's little black bag, and inside there's a bottle, 2 bottles with different pills. And you look at those pills. And so I swallowed the pill,
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, so did I.
And I made a note and I said, that's odd. I wonder if that puts me in a dead man walking situation. So I quickly typed undo and realized that the game world has changed a lot since 1987, because I would never let the player do that in a game I would do today. And your comment about Holmes is spot on. In fact, that hadn't occurred to me until you said it. Although oddly, there's one case where obviously I had it in mind, and that is the Ethereum. If you try and open that anywhere in the game, Holmes will stop you.
True.
So I don't know, maybe it would have been annoying for him to stop you from doing all of that. But again, it was an era when players could kill themselves easily. The idea of taking care of the player is a more modern idea than was really present, I think, generally speaking, in 1987. And it was really Ron Gilbert who championed the idea that the player dying all the time was just not fun, and that game designers shouldn't do that. And I took that to heart in later games.
One thing I noticed is that the game sometimes wants very normal input, not an adventure command like use this or use that, but something a person would really do in that situation. And the best example for that is the librarian in the British Museum, whom you have to tell to be quiet, which is off in terms of how commands in adventures are structured. Usually you have, use item. And here you have to do something that would fit in a normal conversation or which a normal person would do. And I felt those riddles, and they come sometimes in the game, much harder because I have to take off my adventure gaming hat and be a normal person again.
That is so interesting. So I finished the game, and as I looked things over, one of my rules as a designer and my internal rules is that there's no reason for a game designer to make red herrings, because the player will invent so many of them himself that the author doesn't actually have to create red herrings. I mentioned before about Blind Alley and the Red Herring Pub. That was supposed to be a funny thing that, you're in a blind alley. This pub is a red herring. And so I don't remember when that got removed, But when I finished my playthrough, which I did yesterday, I looked over the game and I said, I never solved that librarian. There's an old book there. I guess I had it in the game as a red herring because obviously I was able to get through the game without solving him. And in fact, I even went back. I thought I was really clever because I said, obviously, the solution to this puzzle is wait until Holmes gets ditched. I didn't remember the kidnapping, but I thought if only I could get rid of Holmes, I could open the ampule of Ethereum and knock out the librarian and get at that book. And I knew that it was so obvious that that was the puzzle that I kind of gave up on it. And so after Holmes was kidnapped, I went, now's my chance. And so I went up to the British Museum and I tried to open the ampule and the guy just kept talking. And so it wasn't until you just now said the answer to this puzzle is be quiet. I had no clue. That's true. And now I'm really curious, what was in the book?
The book is the solution to the Westminster Abbey puzzle. It feels like it was added later. It feels like in the modern game, I would say, in playtesting, it came out that the Westminster Abbey riddle was too hard. And somebody took the initiative and put the solution in a book in the British Museum so people could find it if they choose to abandon the Westminster Abbey and explore the world instead. And essentially, it's a book about secret, what's the name, about the citrus juice.
Oh, the secret writing.
Yeah, secret writing.
That makes total sense.
But like most normal players, we found it later when we had solved the puzzle already.
Yeah.
In the progression, you are very clearly gated towards Westminster Abbey, and then you kind of stay there until you've solved the puzzle. But you could go wandering the map and then randomly stumble upon the solution to that and go back. I found it a fair thing because when I started out the game, I felt like, this game might require outside knowledge. So perhaps about the history of England or something, but it never did. And even this one, where you need some knowledge about secret writing, you didn't have to know that. You could get that from a book within the game. Kudos.
Well, it's not entirely true. I think that the game doesn't need outside knowledge, and we'll brush that because there's two puzzles in particular that we'd like to address. We've already talked about a few, but two stick out to us. And the first one, well, I have to preface that by saying that we're in the world of Sherlock Holmes here. And if there's one fundament that this world rests on, it's that everything is logical, and Sherlock Holmes is the archetypical logical character. So that brings us to the pipe puzzle in Madame Tussauds. Since you've played the game, I'm sure you remember it. Just very briefly, you cannot bring open fire into Madame Tussauds, but there's a dark room in there, so you need some sort of light source, and the solution is to light a pipe and then go in there, and then the pipe will provide light. Now, Bob, I hope you don't mind me asking, at that point in your life, had you ever seen a pipe?
Oh, yes, sure, because, those pipes, they glow, Did you do this? Did you go into a perfectly dark room and light a pipe? And you'll find that they glow and provide just enough light to solve all these puzzles. No, that was just ridiculous. And it's worse than that. As we used to say at Infocom, it's worse than that. It makes no sense at all that a dog that has been trained to sniff out fire, it won't let you take a match. It won't let you take an unburnt match, even a match that isn't on fire. It will stop you. And yet, if you light the tobacco and put it in the pipe, that lets you go in, that's just silly. So the illogic of the dog bothered me a lot more than the illogic of the light. Because I think it's almost accidental that the pipe will provide enough light, because I think the solution that I had in mind is that once you were past the dog, then obviously what you would do if you needed light was you would set one of those pieces of paper on fire, and that would provide the light that would get you into the next room. And so that was the solution. The fact that the light from the pipe would let you do that is almost incidental, and in fact might be accidental. That might be just due to a flag in the game that any fire is a source of light.
That would make a lot of sense.
But the illogic of the dog letting you by with the fire in the pipe, that bothered me a lot. That was just silly.
Christian, ask about the tide puzzle.
Yeah, the second one is the tide puzzle. And I'm a bit torn about that because I think that could be one of the best puzzles that I've ever encountered in a adventure game. That makes perfect sense in the game world, in particular since it uses the progression of time or a certain point in time. And Sherlock is a game which has a progression of time. If a puzzle makes use of that, I think that's appreciated. And if it's as clever as that, then it's twice appreciated. However, the one thing that basically kills it for me is the fact that the Thames is a river that has tides, is never addressed in the game and also not really in the documentation. I mean, there is the tide table in the newsletter, but that's not with respect to the Thames. That's under the meteorological chart for the entirety of Western Europe. And so for me, knowing that the Thames is a river that has tide is external information. And to be honest, I didn't know that. I learned that from your game.
There's an interesting story that attaches to this. You know, one of the things that made Infocom a really great company is they had a very strong testing group. And I still have a binder with the bug reports. And the thing about Infocom testers, one is that they weren't shy and would very much challenge whether something was fair or not. And the sense of verisimilitude that we were going for with the game, where we actually, if I remember correctly, wrote off to the London Times and asked for permission to excerpt some of their ads and their content from that day in 1887. So the issue of the tides became a big issue with the testers because they wanted to have the actual tides from that day. They wanted the game to be accurate to that degree. And I said, no, I forget what the times were, but that's too hard on the player. We should make the tides be something that's useful in the game or playable in the game. And so that was that argument. The idea that people didn't know that it was a tidal river, I didn't think of that. Maybe that comes from being too familiar with London until you mentioned it again just now, the idea that someone would not know that the Thames is a tidal river. That's kind of a surprise to me. It's like, of course, you would know that. Everybody knows that, which, by the way, is, if you think about, again, the role in the life of a game designer, one of the biggest problems that you have is exactly that, is to say, what is it that everybody knows? What is it that I can safely refer to without providing additional information or context? So, for example, I would say it's safe now to say everybody knows that Big Ben is in London, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Is it safe to the same extent to say everybody knows the Brandenburg Gate is in Berlin? I don't think that's true. I think most Americans, if you said, what's the Brandenburg Gate? They would shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And this is a problem all the time when you are doing a puzzle and you make a reference to, let's say, Elvis Presley. At one time in the 1960s or 70s, you could make a reference to Elvis Presley and everybody would know who Elvis Presley was. As time goes by, that becomes less and less true. So at one time, you would feel completely comfortable making a reference to Humphrey Bogart and Casablanca. You know, of course, everybody knows that movie. Today, not true. So over time, you have to be sensitive to what it is that is, in fact, universal knowledge and what isn't. And sometimes you get it wrong. And when you get it wrong, that dates a game. A game becomes unplayable by a modern audience. So I guess if that's the one thing in Sherlock from 33 years ago, then maybe I didn't do such a bad job. But yeah, of course, everybody knows the Thames is a tidal river.
The strength of the approach that we take in playing these old games, like with two people and alternating gameplay, and then telling each other, is that we usually don't encounter puzzles that are unsolvable because we have two tries at it. I tried, he tried it, and my unsolvable puzzle was the pipe. For the life of me, I couldn't think about using that as a light source or even as a fire source. And Christian's obviously was the tide puzzle. But we had help, I solved the tide puzzle and he solved the pipe puzzle. So everything is fine for us. And funny that you mention all these references date a game. A few years ago, we played Superhero League of Hoboken. And that was tough to play if you're not an American of a certain age. So, because that was so full of references.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add quickly that I think that the tide puzzle is a wonderful case study in puzzle design, both good and bad, because it so logically comes out of the simulation of the game and the game world, because it's not just that it's a timed puzzle, so it makes use of the time progression. It also, there's another mechanism at work here, and that is that the Thames obviously has a current, and so we're constantly fighting against that current. And we had an epiphany, a strong, wonderful epiphany, when Gunnar realized that we could simply drop the anchor and then the boat would stand still. That's one part of the solution, and the other one is realizing that the tide will bring us closer to the moss. That's the good stuff. The bad stuff also has to do with the simulation. The first point is, of course, that there is no feedback for this particular situation, that we do not know from within the simulation that the Thames has tide. If we could watch the river and basically see it go higher or lower, or see some indications, some markings or something that would tell us that, then we could infer it from that. And the other point is the logic of how the timing system works. The moss and thus the opal are unreachable at 8:40, and at 8:46, if the tide is high, then Watson certainly can get it.
Yeah, I made exactly the same observations. If you look at the river, it says something like it's oily and black, or some unflattering description of the water, but it doesn't say, and we're at low tide, or we seem to be halfway between low tide and high tide, or, some mention of the tide, come on. Or look at the embankment, or look at the bridge. There are black smears that show we're not at high tide yet. Or actually, if you go stand next to the Thames at low tide, there are actual mud flats that are exposed. So some kind of description of the river or the bridge is so needed there. And then I did the exact same thing. I was saying row upstream, and then I'd wait and I'd drift down, and then I'd say, oh my God, this is so hard, because I have to keep doing this. Because at that point I knew that I was supposed to be under the bridge and that something was going on. And it wasn't until after I solved the puzzle and came, and I guess I got out and the boat drifted away or something. And I thought, oh man, I could have dropped the anchor. And so I went back and tried that and said, duh. So yeah, I also failed to realize that you could drop the anchor, which would have made this a lot less tedious in order to have the player have to keep rowing upstream. But on the other hand, the idea that the boat would fetch up at Trader's Gate and that it was there later in the game and that you could use it again, that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that was very nice.
Then again, I thought getting in that boat wearing a suit of armor, it should surely have sunk the boat. And I thought, oh my goodness, at that point, Holmes isn't around. Am I really going to be able to walk through London with this suit of armor on and nobody noticing? And oh, by the way, I've been walking all across the streets of London carrying an oar, Captain Bligh's oar, which may, in fact, fit in the medical bag. I'm not sure. And the whole notion, and again, this is a product of the era, soon abandoned this idea of this is how much you can carry, and there's a limit, there's a weight limit, there's an item limit. In these games, usually every item actually has a size in the game. And as a designer, you give the player character a capacity, and you've got this finickiness where, if you try to pick up something that exceeds your capacity, you've got to drop something else. And in some cases, that's useful for puzzle solving. But in general, it's just a big pain. And I totally went away from that in later games.
Christian, do you have another question? My only question that I still have is an ending question, so please go on.
One or two more that lead us back to the beginning, actually, because we already mentioned that the game has locations like Westminster Abbey, which are relatively detailed, have descriptions of all of the grave sites and so on. And we wondered, how did you actually do your research?
So I love that building. Having been there many times, this is not something I bought for the game, but it's something that I had. It's a huge, what we call it in the States, a coffee table sized book. So one of these really large, hardbound books about Westminster Abbey with all of the different tombs and stories behind them. And there's a map in that book that lays out the location of all of the tombs. And it was using that book as a guide that I did the layout of the Abbey to be precise, to be accurate. You know, there's a brass rubbing puzzle in the game. I had in 1976 taken a trip to London with a friend of mine from high school, and we had gone into Westminster Abbey, and they had a brass rubbing center there, and I went and did a brass rubbing that is a big picture of Sherlock, and that has hung in my study. My wife framed it for me after we got married, and I've had it ever since. I see it every day. So it's a special place for me personally. But that's how I did the research for that building. I had that book. I was familiar with the building. I had been there many times, and I liked the place.
Can you still remember how you approached the planning of the game? So once you had settled on the idea and the plots, how did you approach the actual design? Did you first map the game world? Did you first determine the puzzles?
Wow. I don't know. My plan for this interview was to play through the game without hints and then go get my notes from developing it. And I couldn't solve the game. And so I ran out of time, basically. And so yesterday afternoon, actually, I got a walkthrough and used that walkthrough for the last probably quarter of the game. And especially, oh my God, for the very final puzzle in Moriarty's lair, where somehow you're supposed to figure out that you put Ethereum in your hat. That's the solution to that puzzle. Oh my God. Even with the walkthrough, I was looking at it going, you cannot be serious. And that took me up to yesterday afternoon. And so yesterday I went back into the back room, pulled out the box, and found a huge pile of notepads full of design thoughts and said, I don't have time to read this, so I can't answer your question. I probably did what's typical of these games, which is to say, I need to scatter some things around. What are the high points that I want to hit? Well, obviously, I want to do something at Big Ben. I want to do something in the Tower of London. You know, pick the parts that everybody knows and design puzzles for that. Then blend that with the world of homes. So you've got 221B Baker Street. You've got the Diogenes Club where Mycroft hangs out. You probably have some shady opium den someplace. And so you start to think of these places and what you can do there. And then you think about the objects. You know, it's like, all right, he's stolen the crown jewels. I'm going to scatter jewels across the game. Where can I hide them? Oh, Big Ben, I can put one up in Big Ben. All right, what would be a puzzle there? Well, maybe the bell rings and you can take the gem. Oh, but you know, maybe the bell is so loud that you can't do it because you clap your hands over your ears. And by the way, how come when you go into the room with the old librarian, you can't put cotton in your ears and be able to stop his yammering, or even go outside, put cotton balls in your ears, and then go inside? How is it that he is so much louder than Big Ben? I mean, good grief. And then you think about the pieces of history and you go, well, here's Charles who had his head chopped off, and you got Madame Tussauds. And so you've got a wax head and wax melts. And so let's do a puzzle where you have to melt his head. These things, they grow usually through accretion. I had at one point a huge whiteboard that ran the length of a room, and all of my games up through Blackstone Chronicles were designed on that whiteboard, which was interesting because a whiteboard, especially in those days, it's hard to erase it completely. And so as I was working on one game, sometimes I would see the shadows of previous games kind of poking through. But I mention it because as you're putting a game like this together, when it's up on a whiteboard, an adventure game begins to have a shape. And you recognize that you're close to the finish of a design as that shape emerges. Because like in one column, you've got locations, and in another column, you've got objects, and in another column, you've got ideas for puzzles. And so you'd have something like Charles's head, the fact that he was beheaded, and then you have Madame Tussauds, where things are made of wax, and you go, oh, maybe I could take the head and put the gem inside of it and melt the head to get the gem. Now, that puzzle could just as easily been, I'm sitting there looking at that and going, oh, Westminster Abbey. A lot of people buried at Westminster Abbey. I wonder if this guy was beheaded, could I go to his tomb and open up his tomb and find his head inside and have some puzzle associated with that? At that point, you go, well, okay, was Charles buried at Westminster Abbey? No. Okay, I can't do that. So this stuff emerges, and as you start to draw lines between the objects and the places and the people and the puzzles, things start to fall into place and they start to match up. And as things become more and more matched up, you realize that you are closer and closer to the end of the design. If you look at the development materials, which I've actually published for Thaumastery, I took pictures of my whiteboard. It's not the original one because when Legend shut down, it was too big to fit in my house. So I don't have it any longer. But I do have whiteboards up in my study. And if you look at the development materials for Thaumastery, you'll see that process in action. You'll see lines being drawn between people and places and things. So I don't remember it specifically for Sherlock, but I'm sure that that's how it must have happened.
I think we should point out for context that this was your first game and you had no prior experience as a game designer, but you did have prior experience as a game player. And based on what I heard and the experience with the game, I would assume that you approached the design of Sherlock, of your first game, more from the point of view of a player than from the point of view of a designer. When I was young, I remember that I was frustrated with text adventures because of their limitations, in particular the lack of detail, the lack of feedback. And I said to myself that if I was ever to create a text adventure, it would have an answer for everything that a player would type in. I would baffle the player with my foresight and my attention to detail. And in playing Sherlock, I kind of felt like meeting a kindred soul, and in particular playing your other games, your later games, where there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of feedback, and there's a lot of foresight. And in Sherlock, the kind of schizophrenic thing is that it has a lot of surprising answers to things that a player can try and little remarks, and there's very little commands which result in this doesn't work. You're always trying to phrase it differently or giving some context. And at the same time, as you mentioned, there are situations where something glaringly obvious should be working, but doesn't work.
So I very much came at it. I remember that experience specifically saying, man, if I did a game and somebody tried to go north where there wasn't a north exit, the game, instead of saying, you can't go that way, which is what games did, I would come up with a reason. And so in Sherlock, if you try and go in odd directions, often you'll see something like the crowd pushes you. You can't make your way through the crowd, or there's some reason for that. But it turns out there's a problem with that. And the problem is this. When presented with an obstacle, it, of course, looks like a puzzle. One of the roles of the designer is to make it clear to the player where there is a puzzle and where there is not. And so the phrase, you can't go that way, is a very useful phrase because it's a clear signal to the player that there is no puzzle here. If you say the crowd blocks your way, then maybe you go, oh, if I can distract the crowd, if I can create a diversion, what's the puzzle to get through here? And it's only until you see several of those messages that are all the same that you realize that it is a clear signal that literally you can't go that way. So in an interior, it's easy because there are doors and walls and you're not going to be able to walk through the wall. But when you're outside and you're on a city street and you want to walk in a direction and the game says you can't go that way, as a player, that felt to me like a slap in the face. And as I designed Sherlock, I tried to provide reasons for that. Later on, I think I probably embraced the more direct approach. But that notion of when I started, I very much felt like it was me versus the player. And as I went along in my career, I felt more and more it was me with the player, that you and I are there to have a good time. And a lot of what you do as you try and solve a puzzle is not the right thing. In fact, most of the things that you do when you're trying to solve a puzzle are the wrong thing. And this is entertainment. And so my job is to entertain you as you are doing the wrong thing. And oh, by the way, if you intentionally do the wrong thing, then let's have even a little bit more fun.
That makes a lot of sense. So I have only one silly little question left, and then Gunnar, you can bring this to a close. And my question is regarding the Bank of England that you visit in the game. If you make it to the vault, there are 999 safe deposit boxes in there, and we have the master key, so we can open any one of them. And we were wondering, did you hide an Easter egg in any of these boxes?
Wow.
What is your birthday?
Kind of unlikely, possible. If I did, I don't remember. And it would be in my notes. If I were making the game today, I probably would do that. I think the answer to that's no. But at some point, if I ever do go through my design notepads and notebooks on this, if the answer is yes, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
So my final question is, did Sherlock Holmes achieve his goal by appointing Watson as the person to solve this case? I feel Watson pretty much did everything that Moriarty wanted.
Yes, well, clearly Moriarty's laying a trap for Holmes and is lying in wait for him, knowing that when he comes out of the bank, he knows that he'll be able to kidnap Holmes. So Watson, I have to say, performed admirably. He did exactly what Sherlock wanted him to do, and in that regard was successful, that Sherlock knew he was in danger, gave Watson the signet ring in order to get in touch with Mycroft in case he was kidnapped, and he trusted that Watson was more capable than Watson himself gave himself credit for. Now, you can wonder why Mycroft knew to send Watson to the Tower of London, to get a suit of armor and all that. I mean, that didn't make sense. But in general, the general conceit is thin, but I think it works. It's okay if Holmes had been a more active participant. And one of the mental justifications for him not being more active is that he's giving Watson a chance to solve these things on his own. And when he provides information, it's in his specific area of expertise, like when he looks at the cigar ash in Madame Tussauds and said, oh, this is of a particular kind of ash in the Sherlock Holmes world. He's made this huge study of the ashes of different tobaccos from all over the world. So it would make sense that he would know that this particular ash came from India and that he would recognize these gems as being part of a collection of gems that was stolen from India. So it's thin, but, I think it kind of works. Kind of okay. Gives us the excuse to have a nice romp through Victorian London.
It works as a mechanic for the game, but I found it very thin in retrospective because I thought, what has Watson done except for acting admirably in the final puzzle, because all the rest he did was what Moriarty expected. And one thing you mentioned, to hide the ampoule in the hat, that is actually mentioned in the first quarter of an hour of the game, as Sherlock Holmes says, put it under your hat.
Does he really?
Yeah, then you do that, and you take your hat off as Watson, and then you find the stethoscope, which I would never have found because you based this on one mention in Scandal in Bohemia, which I had totally forgotten.
Yeah, I noted that in my own playthrough. It's like, how would a player ever know to do that? But if it's true that Holmes specifically tells you to do that, then I feel much better about this. And that also explains why, as I was going around and I would take out the ampule, he would say, hey, Watson, don't have that be so obviously present. So you couldn't really move around, or you couldn't do stuff with the ampule out in the open. But I just put it in the bag. And if he told me to put it under my hat, I didn't notice it. That makes me feel good, because then in the act of taking off your hat, presumably you would have found the stethoscope.
Yeah, that was what I did. And at first I thought this was a figure of speech. Put it under your hat, but then I tried it out in reality and then it worked. Christian, on the other hand, walked all around London with the ampoule in his hand and got admonished by Sherlock Holmes all the time.
Constantly, yeah. But the nice thing about this, and I really appreciate this design, is that the solution to one of the last puzzles in the game is presented to me from the very first moment on, essentially. As soon as I try to leave Baker Street with the ampoule, Sherlock Holmes already tells me you need to hide it. He doesn't specifically at this point tell me where to hide it, but I really like the thought that I could have known from the very beginning that that would become relevant later on. The one thing about what Gunnar mentioned about the logic of Sherlock Holmes reasoning that there's a trap, and so to thwart Moriarty, you need to take over Watson. But we ultimately never learn what the trap was, or whether there was a trap to begin with. We would have liked to learn that.
Sure you do, because he planned to kidnap Holmes.
He says in the end that the guard acted on its own. That was an accident, essentially. That was not part of the plan. The guard did that on its own volition.
Moriarty tells you that when you ask him about Holmes.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, believe us. We've just played it.
Yeah.
We know everything about your game.
Okay. Oh, well.
Well, if that had been the trap, then Sherlock Holmes' plan didn't work, because he falls into it.
No, I believe the trap was that you get caught in the end when you enter the bar of gold, and then you are tied up or held by Akbar, and then Moriarty does this all villain explaining thing. I believe that was the trap. And Sherlock Holmes fell into it by accident, as Christian mentioned, but Watson did exactly what Moriarty wanted, and then had this genius moment that Holmes perhaps planned for all the time, that you take the ampoule from under your hat. And this was the one thing Holmes perhaps counted on Watson doing. So blunder through the game somehow, and then draw the ampoule in the right moment. And this was the one thing that Holmes mentioned all the time. So,
you know, the interesting thing is that this is actually a game with a plot narrative that you can speculate about, that we can build theories around and discuss opinions about. And that's already an achievement, I think, because for most of the games, in particular of that era, that is certainly not the case.
Yeah, and I mentioned this with regard to red herrings, and it's fascinating to a designer to hear about all the different things that people think that never occurred to you as a designer. People make up their own reasons, their own puzzles, their own theories about what's going on. And in a game more than in a book, the player has a chance to test those out. Books tend to be a lot more ambiguous because you can't query them. You can't poke at them. They just sit there and you speculate a lot about what the author had in mind. Games, because they're interactive, you have a better opportunity to do that. But, you know, as I think about it, I think it's clear that Moriarty, I mean, he's saying, meet me at this place at this time using this password. So it's clearly setting up a meet. And if you're Sherlock, you're saying, I'm going to walk into that trap and trust that I am clever enough to deal with it. And as added insurance, I have my trusty Watson, who I can rely on as my man of action to help me out. So I'm kind of okay with it, that he's going into this with his eyes wide open, so to speak.
Fair enough.
Fair enough.
Christian, anything else to add?
Nope.
This is all the questions we have. Thank you very much for answering them all.
Well, thanks for doing this. It was interesting. As I say, I haven't played the game in many, many, many years. And I do have such a horrible memory that it is in many ways like encountering the game for the first time. And there's a delight, actually, that comes with something like, I wonder what will happen if I do this. And to find that I anticipated that and handled it and made a small piece of entertainment out of that little interaction is fun. It's fun for me. And it turns out that I think like myself, I guess is a good way to put that. The fact that I wanted to try it as a player meant that as a designer, I had done a decent job of anticipating what a player, at least this player, might want and might try. And I think a mark of success in these games is the more oddball things you can handle, the more you can have that back and forth between the player and the author, the more fun the game is. So having a chance to experience that again was nice.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye bye. So, und willkommen nochmal zur Zusammenfassung von unserem Gespräch mit Bob Bates, das wirklich sehr angenehm war. Gunnar und ich mögen den Bob ja wirklich gerne. Und ich glaube, bei dem Gespräch hat man auch gehört, warum. Sehr reflektierter Mensch, selbstkritisch, kann sich sehr gut ausdrücken. Wir haben neue Sachen erfahren über Sherlock und das ist, glaube ich, das allererste Mal, dass uns das passiert ist, in all den Interviews, die wir bisher geführt haben für Stay Forever Spielt, ist das erste Mal, dass einer der Designer tatsächlich sein eigenes Spiel vorher nochmal gespielt hat. Zumindest durchgespielt hat. Und das hat Bob Bates gemacht und er hat sich dann im Laufe unseres Gesprächs auch ziemlich selbstkritisch zu einigen Situationen geäußert. Aber fangen wir von vorne an, wie kam es eigentlich zu dem Spiel? Das war Mitte der 80er Jahre, wo der Bob Bates sich gerade als Autor versucht hat, an einem eigenen Roman geschrieben. Das ging nur so mäßig. Von seinem Vater hat er damals einen TSR-80 bekommen als Gerät, um darauf zu schreiben, also mit einer Textverarbeitung. Da war aber dann auch Sorg mit drauf und so hat er Kontakt zu den Textadventures bekommen. Er war vorher kein Spieler und hat dann mit einem Kollegen aus seinem Chor, dem Dave Wild, eine Firma gegründet, Challenge Inc. Der Dave war für das Technische zuständig und der Bob für das Inhaltliche. Und da hat sich aber schnell rausgestellt, so eine eigene Text-Adventure-Engine zu schreiben, das ist ganz schön aufwendig. Können wir die nicht irgendwie lizenzieren? Naja, dann hat der Bob Bates bei Infocom angerufen und gefragt, ob er die Engine lizenzieren kann. Und die hätten ihm dann gesagt, okay, für $1 Million kannst du sie haben. Für so ein jung gegründetes 2-Mann-Unternehmen ganz schön viel. Dann hat er schließlich ein Gegenangebot gemacht, gibt eine Lizenz für 10 Spiele für jeweils 100.000 Euro pro Stück. Fanden die interessant und haben gesagt, pass auf, unser Geschäftsführer, der von Activision, also von der Firma, die uns gerade gekauft hat, der ist demnächst bei dir in der Gegend auf der Durchreise, vielleicht kannst du den am Flughafen treffen. Dann hat Bob Bates ihn dort getroffen und diesem Geschäftsführer von Activision detailliert erklärt, welche Infocom-Spiele vermutlich ein Erfolg waren, ein finanzieller, welche nicht und warum. Also quasi eine detaillierte Analyse. Und tags darauf hatte er den Joel Perez, den Chef von Infocom, am Telefon. Der sagte, pass auf, vergiss das mit der Lizenz. Wir wollen dich als externen Entwickler anheuern. Und so kam es dann, dass Challenge Inc., der Name übrigens wurde deswegen gewählt, weil Bob den Gedanken hatte, wenn ihr dachtet, dass Infocom-Spiele schwer sind, dann wartet mal, bis ihr ein Challenge-Spiel gespielt habt. Also so kam es, dass er dann Auftragsarbeiten für Infocom gemacht hat, beziehungsweise nicht wirklich Auftragsarbeiten, es waren schon seine eigenen Spiele, die aber dann unter dem Label Infocom erschienen sind, auch mit den entsprechenden Packungen und so weiter. Und seine Serie hieß Immortal Legends und es war angedacht, dass da 3 Spiele kommen sollten, nämlich ein Spiel zu Sherlock Holmes, ein Spiel zur Artus-Sage und ein Spiel zu Robin Hood. Das Robin Hood-Spiel hat es nie gegeben, aber die anderen beiden sind erschienen und das Sherlock war also nicht nur dieses das war nicht nur das erste Spiel, das Infocom als Textadventure extern hat produzieren lassen. Es war auch das erste Spiel von Bob Bates überhaupt. Und das sollte man generell im Kopf behalten. Das war sein Erstlingswerk. Der hat vorher noch nie ein Spiel designt gehabt. Und dementsprechend haben sich da in das Sherlock natürlich auch, der ein oder andere Anfängerfehler, sagen wir mal, eingeschlichen. Der Bob Bates hat als Jugendlicher lange Zeit in England verbracht, 4 Jahre. Das heißt, er hatte eine natürliche Affinität zu dem Land und eine Faszination seit jeher für englische Geschichte. Und natürlich aber auch gepaart mit Kenntnissen von eben dieser Geschichte und den dazugehörigen Orten. Und Sherlock als Spiel ist durchaus auch ein Versuch, diese faszinierenden Elemente der Geschichte zum Leben zu erwecken. Viel von der Recherche kommt also tatsächlich aus eigener Anschauung. Kurz vorher, beziehungsweise nicht kurz vorher, sondern ein Jahrzehnt vorher, 1976, da hat Bob auch noch mal eine Reise nach London gemacht mit einem Schulfreund und dort auch all die Orte besucht, vor allen Dingen die Westminster Abbey, die auch im Spiel auftauchen. Und zu der Zeit war da in der Westminster Abbey gerade ein Zentrum fürs Durchpausen von Bildern auf Messingplatten, Messingtafeln. Das ist das sogenannte Brass Rubbing, das ja auch im Spiel vorkommt. Und da hat damals der Bob Bates auch tatsächlich ein Bild durchgepaust, und zwar eines von Sherlock Holmes. Und das hängt seit 1978 gerahmt als Geschenk seiner späteren Ehefrau in seinem Arbeitszimmer. Und auch in dem Moment, wo er den Podcast mit uns aufgenommen hat, das war in seinem Arbeitszimmer, schaute ihn da quasi Sherlock Holmes von der Wand aus an. Also die Informationen zu Sherlock Holmes stammen aus seiner eigenen umfangreichen Sammlung. Er hat so ein Regal voll mit natürlich den ganzen Werken von Arthur Conan Doyle, aber auch Werke darüber oder Derivate, also von anderen Autoren, jede Menge Bücher. Und für sowas wie die Westminster Abbey zum Beispiel hatte er damals schon einen großen Bildband, wo alles detailliert drin war, ein Grundriss der Kirche, die Bilder von den ganzen Grabstätten. Und das war auch also das Anschauungsmaterial für die Gestaltung des Spiels. Warum hat er Watson als Spielcharakter gewählt? Das ist relativ nachvollziehbar. Es stammt aus der Überlegung, dass der Sherlock Holmes, der ist ja seinem Charakter nach ein Genie, und es passt einfach nicht, wenn der sich durch den Spieler gesteuert durch London tölpelt. Abgesehen davon, dass Sherlock Holmes natürlich eine sehr stark definierte Persönlichkeit ist, ein klar, prägnant definierter Charakter, und ihm war nicht so ganz sicher, ob der Spieler sich überhaupt in so ein Charakterkorsett pressen lassen möchte. Also hat er lieber die andere Variante genommen, den Watson, weil das natürlich uns als Spielern die Möglichkeit gibt, den eigentlich starken Charakter, den Sherlock Holmes, viel besser zu erleben, indem man ihn nämlich beobachtet als jemand, der einem zur Seite gestellt ist. Man muss nicht als Sherlock spielen, man kann Sherlock zugucken dabei, wie er Dinge macht. Das ist zumindest die Theorie, und wie gesagt, Bob Bates hat das Spiel ja nochmal gespielt und fragt sich, ob ihm das auch wirklich so gelungen ist, weil er, wie er selber feststellt, Holmes ja im Endeffekt doch ziemlich nutzlos ist. Da mussten wir ihm natürlich beipflichten dann an dieser Stelle. Also ein bisschen eine verschenkte Chance. Er sagt, zum Teil ist das natürlich auch ein Grund dafür ist der limitierte Speicherplatz, war schon sehr begrenzt zur damaligen Zeit, und interessanterweise war das Spiel, als er es dann bei Infocom abgegeben hat zur Produktion, immer noch zu groß. Es heißt, bei Infocom im Haus wurden dann noch Kürzungen vorgenommen. Und Bob erinnert sich nicht mehr, was das war. Er erinnert sich nur noch, dass er sehr erzürnt über diese Kürzungen war. Er glaubt aber, dass es vermutlich nichts mit den Interaktionen mit Sherlock Holmes zu tun hatte, sondern vielleicht eventuell Raumbeschreibungen. Interessanterweise hatte er zu Hause einen ganzen Karton mit altem Material aus der Zeit, seine ganzen Notizbücher und so weiter, und hatte auch noch mal seine alte Karte herausgezogen der Spielwelt und darauf 2 Räume entdeckt, die nicht im Spiel vorkommen. Ist allerdings, um ehrlich zu sein, kein so großer Verlust, denn von der Fleet Street aus gab es in seinem ursprünglichen Plan nach Osten hin noch eine Straße namens Blind Alley und da einen Ort namens Red Herring Pub. Und der Name sagt uns schon, wofür das gedacht war. Ein Red Herring ist ja einfach nur ein Ablenkungsmanöver, etwas Sinnloses in einem Spiel, das aber keine weitere Bedeutung hat. Also vermutlich ist das eine der Sachen, die den Infocom-Kürzungen zum Opfer gefallen sind. Aber das war ja dann nur ein Gag. Also er war jedenfalls im Gespräch mit uns selbst überrascht von der Menge der leeren Räume, die es im Spiel gibt. Er konnte das aus heutiger gereifter Perspektive nicht mehr nachvollziehen, sagte, das würde ich heute mit Sicherheit nicht mehr so machen. Da würde er dem Spieler mehr zu tun geben, aber damals war das so. Er war auch sehr verblüfft über die schiere Menge von, er nannte das Dead Man Walking Situationen, also Sackgassen im Endeffekt, wo man etwas falsch machen kann und sich damit das Spiel verderben, merkt es aber noch nicht und merkt es sehr, sehr viel später im Spiel erst. Also zum Beispiel, wenn man ganz am Anfang des Spiels Watsons Tasche aufmacht und da die Pillen schluckt, dann hat man das Spiel verloren. Weiß es aber nicht, weiß es erst später, wenn man das Rätsel in Covent Garden nicht lösen kann, das Blumenmädchen nicht wiederbeleben. Und da war er er doch sehr frustriert darüber, wie oft das vorkommt, wie oft man da speichern und laden muss. Definitiv etwas, was er später abgelegt hat. Das war echt ganz interessant, mit ihm darüber zu reden und zu hören, wie er reflektiert, darüber, was er als Designer alles in der Zwischenzeit gelernt hat in der Vergangenheit, was er alles dann später entwickelt hat aus diesen ersten Erfahrungen. Denn das war natürlich auch eine Lernerfahrung für ihn. Insbesondere sagte er, es ging seine Philosophie war zu dem Zeitpunkt noch eher so, ich gegen den Spieler, wobei wir ganz ehrlich sagen müssen, dass Sherlock da schon ein deutliches Beispiel von einem Textadventure ist, das sehr häufig auf den Spieler reagiert und das viele Antworten hat, oder auch viele Design-Elemente hat, wo es versucht, dem Spieler Dinge näher zu bringen, klarer zu machen und ihn nicht ins Messer laufen zu lassen. Auf der anderen Seite passiert das natürlich trotzdem noch oft genug. Aber er sagte, dieses Gegeneinander hat er dann relativ schnell abgelegt, gerade zu seiner Zeit bei Legend Games, und hat es eher in einen Dialog umgewandelt, was der Spieler alles versuchen kann. Das versucht er möglichst als Autor aufzunehmen und ihm da eine Geschichte dazu zu erzählen, selbst wenn sie ihn nicht weiterbringen sollte, den Spieler in seinem Handeln. Ja, wir haben ihn natürlich auf die Puzzles angesprochen. Und das Pfeifenpuzzle, ja, das, was ihn viel mehr frustriert hat, als an die Tatsache, dass diese kleine Pfeife die dunkle Chamber of Horrors beleuchten kann, ist die Unlogik des Hundes. Wirklich ganz interessante Perspektive, weil, dass die Pfeife diesen Raum beleuchten kann, war gar keine Absicht. Das ist schlichtweg ein Fehler. Offensichtlich im Spiel, im Spielcode, in der Spiellogik können Gegenstände als brennbar definiert werden und dann sind sie in der Regel auch, das ist dann meistens eine automatische Verbindung, dann spenden sie auch Licht und da wurde scheinbar von ihm vergessen und es ist dann auch beim Testen scheinbar nicht aufgefallen, diese spendet Licht Flagge einfach rauszunehmen für die Pfeife, so dass, weil sie eben brennen kann, sie auch leuchtet und wenn sie leuchtet, beleuchtet sie auch den Raum. Das war aber gar nicht der Gedanke. Der Gedanke war, ganz nachvollziehbar, dass man mit der Pfeife vor der Chamber of Horrors, also in Madame Tussauds, ein Papier anzündet, dann in die Chamber of Horrors geht und mit dem natürlich viel heller leuchtenden brennenden Papier dann schnell die Fackel anzündet. Und das funktioniert ja auch so und macht auch ehrlich gesagt viel mehr Sinn. Deswegen war Bobs Problem auch gar nicht so sehr mit der Pfeifensituation, das war wie gesagt einfach ein Versehen, sondern die Unlogik des Schnüffelhundes da davor, des Wachhundes, hat ihn viel mehr gefuchst, denn dieser Hund, der dürfte den Holmes oder den Watson mit einer glühenden Pfeife da gar nicht reinlassen. Mal abgesehen davon, dass der offensichtlich auch in der Lage ist, nicht mal angezündete Streichhölzer zu erschnüffeln, das hat den Bob genauso gewundert wie uns, aber also das war für ihn der große Designfehler hier, dass dieser Hund nicht stringent und nicht logisch handelt und einen mit der Pfeife durchlässt. Das war eine interessante Perspektive auf das Pfeifenpuzzle. Beim Themse-Puzzle, wir erinnern uns daran, die Gezeiten in der Themse, gibt's auch eine interessante Erklärung, und zwar, dass während des Designs des Spiels sich immer mehr herauskristallisiert hat, dass nicht nur Bob Bates, sondern vor allem auch das Testing-Team von Infocom großen Wert auf historische Genauigkeit legt. Infocom hatte nämlich in-house ein Team von Testern und die haben ihren Job sehr ernst genommen. Die waren auch sehr gut. Das ist auch einer der Gründe, warum die Infocom-Adventures in der Regel fehlerfrei sind und sehr hochwertig sind, weil sie nämlich rigoros getestet wurden. Und es war nicht nur ein reines Qualitätssicherungstesting, sondern durchaus auch inhaltlicher Kommentar. So auch in diesem Fall. Es hatte sich zum Beispiel Infocom schon darum bemüht, bei der London Times aus dem Archiv eine originalgetreue Meldungen von jenem Tag im Juni 1887 abdrucken zu dürfen. Also das, was man in der beiliegenden Zeitung beim Spiel sieht und liest, das sind Originaleinträge aus der Times von damals. Die Zeitung, die der Packung beiliegt, heißt ja nicht Times, sondern Thames. Das ist eigentlich der einzige Unterschied. Ansonsten sind das alles Originalmeldungen. Und nachdem man sich also dann schon auf dieses historische Datum geeinigt hat, auf dieses wirkliche Ereignis mit dem Thronjubiläum, dem Krönungsjubiläum, dann diese Zeitung authentisch war, hat irgendwann das Testing-Team von Infocom laut Bob Bates darauf bestanden, dass auch die Tidenzeiten akkurat sein müssen. Denn Bob hatte offensichtlich vor, das Rätsel sollte sich schon um die Tide drehen, aber die Zeit sollte dann nicht so akkurat sein, beziehungsweise er hat es nicht genau ausgeführt, ihm schwebte so vor, es irgendwo in Spielablauf abzubauen, wo es logischer passt, wo es besser zum Abläufen des Spielers passt. Weiß nicht, inwiefern das geholfen hätte. Er erzählte jedenfalls, das Infocom-Testing-Team hätte darauf bestanden, dass das die historischen Zeiten sein müssen. Die wurden dann in diese Zeitung auch reingeschrieben und deswegen muss man also diesen genauen Zeitpunkt abpassen. Was nichts daran ändert, dass es im Spiel selbst keinen Hinweis auf das Rätsel gibt und das hat Bob genauso bedauert wie wir und sagte auch, der Spieler hat an der Stelle eigentlich seine Aufgabe erfüllt, wenn er die Brücke anschaut, wenn er die Themse anschaut, wenn er also sucht nach Hinweisen und wenn das Spiel sie ihm nicht gibt, dann ist das nicht das Problem oder die Schuld des Spielers, sondern des Designers und des Spiels. Dementsprechend, ja, das war keine Glanzstunde das Feedback-Design, sagen wir mal. Er sagte, das ist einfach veraltetes Spieldesign, genau wie das begrenzte Inventar auch. Das ist jetzt in Sherlock gar nicht so schlimm, hat uns nie gestört, ist natürlich eine alte Infocom-Altlast, etwas, was er dann auch später abgelegt hat. Ja, und zum Schluss haben wir ihn natürlich auch noch getriezt mit dem Plot und der Frage, macht es überhaupt Sinn, was Moriarty da für einen Plan ausgeheckt hat und die Falle und so weiter. Und da konnten wir ihn aber nicht erschüttern, jetzt auch nach nochmal Spielen, zeigte sich Bob Bates im Reinen mit sich selbst und sagte, ich bin mit dem Plot im Großen und Ganzen ganz zufrieden. Ja, die Prämisse ist etwas dünn mit dieser Falle und ja, man würde heutzutage vermutlich keine Rätselsprüche mehr als Designelement nehmen. Es ist sehr unflexibel, diese Rätselsprüche, mit denen man sich da auseinandersetzen muss. Das ist schon ein bisschen angestaubtes Spieldesign. Aber er hat das Spiel nochmal so interpretiert, dass Sherlock da sehenden Auges in diese Gefahr gegangen ist. Durchaus auch dadurch gekennzeichnet, dass er Watson ja zwischendurch auch seinen Ring gibt und sagt, es könnte sein, dass mir was zustößt. Aber sich darauf verlässt, dass wenn die Falle zuschnappt, er schon mit seinem scharfen Verstand reagieren kann. Aber falls das doch nicht passieren sollte, dann ist sein Plan B, seine Rückversicherung, Watson zu einem Handelnden zu machen und für Watson damit auch eine Art Bewährungsprobe zu schaffen. Sherlock Holmes traut Watson mehr zu, als Watson sich selbst zutraut und deswegen hält er sich auch weitgehend raus, laut Bob Bates, oder zumindest kann man das so interpretieren, dem Watson unter die Arme zu greifen. Ist natürlich etwas wohlfeil, um die sehr passive Rolle von Sherlock zu rechtfertigen, aber gut, gehen wir einfach mal kurz mit diesen Weg. Also es ist auch gleichzeitig noch eine Bewährungsprobe für Watson, der auch ermächtigt werden muss. Der muss, damit er am Ende auch wirklich das Ruder rumreißen kann, muss er auch durch diesen ganzen Reifen springen und muss merken, dass er in der Lage ist, den Fall voranzutreiben. Das ist also quasi eine Rückversicherung für den Fall, dass Sherlock doch irgendwas zustoßen sollte. Und so kommt es ja dann auch, dass die Wache in der Bank da übereifrig ist und Sherlock ausschaltet, war ja nicht Teil von Moriartys Plan. Konnte unserer Meinung nach der Sherlock Holmes auch nicht so richtig gut voraussehen, aber es passt ja am Endeffekt dann insofern, als er dann rausfällt, also sein Plan A, ich werde dann schon, wenn ich zu Moriarty vorstoße, spontan wissen, was ich da tun soll, ist damit gescheitert, aber er hat ja, weil er der vorausschauende Sherlock Holmes ist, noch sein Ass im Ärmel und dieses Ass heißt Watson und am Ende rettet Watson dann ja auch den Tag. Also wir sind uns alle einig, das ist schon ein bisschen sehr dünn, diese ganze Geschichte, aber Bob Bates, wie gesagt, sagte, eigentlich ging es ja hauptsächlich darum, dann ein nettes kleines Abenteuer in dieser spannenden Zeit des viktorianischen Londons zu haben mit diesen bekannten Charakteren. Und das können wir, glaube ich, unterstreichen. Das ist dann etwas, was das Spiel doch leistet. Und das haben wir auch genossen. So, das war meine dann am Ende doch nicht ganz so kurze Zusammenfassung von dem, was wir hier gerade gehört haben. Ich hoffe, das hat euch gefallen und ich hoffe insgesamt, dass euch die Staffel gefallen hat. Und wir begeben uns jetzt mal auf die Suche nach dem nächsten Spiel, was Stay Forever spielt. Bis dahin, tschüss.